In our last talk of the session will be our invited talk from Dr. Luis Aviles Felix. Dr. Felix got his PhD in physics from 2015 from the Instituto Balseiro / Cuyos National University of the Engineering in Lima, Peru. He's done two postdocs, one at the Magnetic Resonance Laboratory uh, of Centro Atomico Baruch, and one at SpinTech Lab of France, Alternate Energies and Atomic Energy Commission in Grenoble, France. And he's currently a researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Research, or COSINET, in Argentina. And his current research focuses on spin dynamics and low dimensional systems and magnetotransport in micro and nanostructures. So, Luis, are you here? Can you share your screen?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, nice. Thank you, Justin, for the nice introduction. And I would like to thank you, all the organizer, for giving me this to share my work with you. Today, I'm going to talk about the magnetotransport and spin transport in ultra-low damping iron cobalt layers. Of course, the result I'm going to show you is a work of different people, particularly of my recent students, Aldair, Hans, Lautaro, and Chiara. So they have done an amazing work the last few months. So this is This is the outline of my talk. I'm going to start with a brief introduction and motivation. Then I will pass to discuss the main characteristic related to the structural and magnetic characterization and the magnetization dynamics using ferromagnetic resonance of iron cobalt layers with different relative concentration between iron and cobalt. Related to our recent results on the magnetotransport, I will focus on the anisotropic magnetoresistance in epitaxial iron cobalt layers, particularly in the alloy 6535. And if I have some time, I will share some results on the STFMR results on iron cobalt with different concentration. So why is important? Why is damping important in magnetic materials? As some of you know, there is a technological problem that is associated to the device. We need to reduce the energy consumption and to enhance the efficiency in spintronic device for the case of NROM memories. Okay, so this damping determines what are the speed and efficiency of our device. In the case of an MRAM device, we know that the magnetic tunnel junction is the core element of this type of device, and their operation is determined by how fast can we switch between a low resistance state and a high resistance state. These two storage states are given by the relative orientation between the magnetization of the ferromagnetic layer, and to switch between this low resistance state and high resistance state, we can use, for example, an external magnetic field or a spin polarized current. By the use of a spin polarized current, we can, with the use of a spin polarized current, we can develop some device known as STT-MRAM, spin transfer torque MRAM. And the current that we require to pass or to switch the magnetization from up to down depends on different parameters of our system. For example, the saturation magnetization, the thickness of the ferromagnetic layer, the anisotropies involved in our device, and of course the magnetic damping. So if we want to develop, or if we want to design some material with low consumption, we need to find materials with low damping values. Okay. However, if we want faster devices, we need large damping values. So there is a compromise that we need to overcome during the design of our devices. So, and this reduces to understand the switching mechanism in magnetic layers with a special focus on the interplay between the spin currents and the spin orbit coupling, because those phenomena are the origin of this. So now what happened with the iron cobalt? Why is this important? So you know that the iron cobalt is a well-known alloy that has been studied for more than 15 years. But in 2013, it appeared this paper of Mankowski and collaborators, in which they claimed, or they reported, that via simulation there is a minimum on the damping for a specific concentration of cobalt. They said that this alloy present a really low damping values for cobalt concentration between 0.1 and 0.2. However, the experiment at that time did not reflect that prediction of Mankowski. It was not until 2016 in which the group of Justin Shaw at NIST they accurately determined the values of damping for these iron cobalt layers in polycrystalline layers. They also accompanying their experimental results with simulation of the density of state for the different alloys, as you can see here. Now we know what happened in this alloy and why the damping values are low in this case. So as you know, in the model of the Brillouin-Fermi surface, in which the intrinsic damping depends on the density of state, supports the theory of finding these really low damping values in this alloy. So in going back to our local result, in 2016 also a PhD thesis that was conducted by Daniel Velázquez. And in our case, we managed to fabricate epitaxial layers of iron cobalt. Okay, we also reproduce the minimum damping values, but also we found another property such as anisotropic damping that I'm going to mention in the next slides. So now I'm going to pass what are the features of this type of alloys. In our group, we managed to fabricate nice epitaxial films on top of MgO, as you can see here in this TEM image of the in this TEM image. On the other hand, with the X-ray diffraction, we verify that the unit cell of the iron cobalt is rotated with respect to the unit cell of the MgO. Okay, we use MgO as a substrate. At the end, in this case, all the samples kept their cubic their cubic symmetry. Okay. However, if you check in this schematic, the 100 direction of the iron cobalt was rotated 45 degrees with respect to the unit cell of the MgO. And if we start with the characterization, the magnetic characterization of this sample, for the case of iron 65, cobalt 35, we have that the cubic EC axis is along the 1 minus 1, 0, along this direction, and the hard axis is along the 1, 0, 0. Okay, this is reflected in the typical hysteresis loop. However, if we start to change or rotate the direction of the magnetic field, we observe this type of curves. Okay, it appears that the hysteresis loop obtained with our Kerr magnetometer show a two-jump magnetization process. So this is an indication or a signature that there is the presence of a uniaxial anisotropy in the system. The two-jump magnetization process indicates that these two uniaxial and cubic anisotropy are competing along the different directions. In this particular case, for the sample iron 65, cobalt 35, we found that the 1, 0 axis correspond to the uniaxial hard axis and is the same as the one of the cubic EC axis. This was also verified for, or the cubic anisotropy was also verified for the different concentrations. For example, here in the sample iron 80, cobalt 20, during our FMR experiments, we obtained different spectra in which the resonance field or the dependence of the resonance field as a function of the external magnetic field direction changes, okay, as we rotate the direction. For example, here, zero field or the angle of 0 correspond to the magnetic field applied along the 100 direction of the MgO, and then this decreases as we rotate the magnetic field, and then increases again when the direction of the external field is 90 degrees. Okay, so this dependence of the resonance field reflects the symmetry of our system. On the other hand, from the FMR experiments, we can also quantify what's the cubic anisotropy constant, and we observe that there is or as we start to increase the cobalt concentration in our epitaxial layer, there is a change in the of the sign of the cubic anisotropy constant. This was easily verified by plotting the difference resonance field as a function of the field direction, in which we have for the samples with cobalt 15 or cobalt 20 or cobalt 25, there is a minimum okay, at 45 degrees, then suddenly becomes a maximum in the resonance field as we continue increasing the cobalt content. Okay, so you can see here in this table that the cubic anisotropic constant reduces and suddenly change its sign and increases as for the sample of cobalt 30 and cobalt 35. On the other hand, from the FMR experiments also, we observe an anisotropic damping. So this means that the value of damping changes depending on the direction we are measuring the broadband ferromagnetic resonance experiment. Now, what happened with the magnetotransport? What happened in the anisotropic magnetoresistance in this type of alloys? We know that the iron cobalt is a 3D transition metal, and the anisotropic magnetoresistance is due to the spin-orbit coupling. Okay, just a schematic picture of this. If we have a material or a 3D ferromagnet with no spin-orbit coupling, we have the usual splitting of the spin bands. Okay. However, if we turn on or if we consider the spin-orbit coupling, there is a mixing, a spin mixing and reorientation of the d orbitals. Um, uh, of the d orbitals, and how this impact in the magnetotransfer properties. This spin mixing uh, of the orbitals creates new scattering mechanism for the electrons. Initially, if we have that the electron only can scatter between the S band to the D band, now we have that the majority spin S in this case can scatter into the other band, into the D band with the same spin. But due to the spin mixing as a result of the spin orbit coupling. So how this manifests in our system? Now we have that the anisotropic magnetoresistance ratio can be measured in our macroscopic sample, and before pass to the result, we need to ask ourselves the following question: in the iron cobalt layers, in the epitaxial iron cobalt layers, we observe a cubic and uniaxial anisotropy. In the system, we observe also a change in the cubic anisotropy constant for samples with higher cobalt content, and we observe an anisotropic damping also for higher cobalt content. So all these phenomena we observe that we discuss here depends on the spin orbit coupling. Now, it's reasonable to think that if anisotropic magnetoresistance also depend on the spin orbit coupling, we can expect an anisotropic magnetoresistance that also depend on the crystalline orientation. Okay, so let's go to the results, to the main results of our work. In this case, I only going to explain or share with you the results on the iron 65, cobalt 35. But if you want to know more on this alloy with higher iron content, you can take a look of to the talk of Lautaro Saba, one of my students, that is 2 hours from now, and he will kindly share our recent studies published in Journal of Physics Day. Related to the iron 65 cobalt 35, as we show in our previous slide, in this case, the EC axis is along the 1 - 10 direction. Okay, this is the EC axis and this is the hard axis. And what we did with our sample was to fabricate different hall bars, okay, with different hall bars oriented along the crystallographic direction. In one case, we apply the current along the EC axis, okay, like this, and on the other case, we apply the current along the hard axis. So one of the first measurement we performed was to apply the current along the 100 direction, the hard axis, okay, and then saturate the sample and measure the longitudinal and transversal resistivity as a function of the magnetic field direction. In this experiment, as the sample is rotated, as the sample is saturated, we can obtain the anisotropic magnetoresistance ratio and verify that when the current, okay, that is along 100 is parallel to the magnetic field, we have a high resistance state. And when the magnetic field is transversal to the current direction, we have a minimum resistance state. Okay, this is a signature of the anisotropic magnetoresistance. From this experiment, we can obtain the anisotropic magnetoresistance ratio, not only for room temperature, but also for different temperatures. So the first thing we observe is that there is an anisotropy in the AMR ratio. We kind of expected that because it also depends on the spin-orbit coupling. However, as you can see here at room temperature, the AMR ratio is lower when we apply the current along the EC axis and higher when we apply the current along the hard axis. So now, if we change the temperature, we see that both AMR ratios increases as we decrease the temperature. In the case when the current is parallel to the hard axis, this change is kind of low. It's not as significant as on the case when we have the current parallel to the EC axis. Okay, so this temperature dependence of the AMR ratio and the percentage change, the change with the temperature is still an open question for us, but we have an hypothesis that this might be determined by the electron scattering mechanism, the different electron scattering mechanism at different temperatures, or probably change in the cubic anisotropy constant that are originated by tetragonal distortions in our cell. When we increase the cobalt content in our unit cell, we probably are distorting the unit cell, and this is the origin of this anisotropy in the AMR. Okay. On the other hand, we can also measure, for example, longitudinal resistance as a function of the external magnetic field. Okay, in this case, this experiment were performed by or were done by applying the current along the cubic EC axis. Okay, this case is the current is applied along the 1, 1 0 direction, and the external magnetic field is applied along the hard axis. Okay, along the 1 0 0. So you can see here, this is just as a reference, the Kerr hysteresis loop, in which we indicated in red the points associated to the decreasing field, and in blue the points, the data associated to the increasing field. So when we measure the longitudinal resistance as a function of the external magnetic field, we see that the magnetization aligns at high field with the external field. And then if we start to decrease the magnetic field towards zero, the magnetization aligns along the EC axis, along this direction. And then the longitudinal resistance present a maximum. And then if we start to decrease the external magnetic field toward negative values, we see a downward peaks. Okay, this is this peak here that you see that is the same or is around the same value of the coercive field. This increase again because once the magnetization switches to the negative field values, it continuously oriented with the external magnetic field, and this behavior can be explained in the same way when we increase the external field as shown in the blue point. Okay, on the other hand, the transversal resistivity dependence with the external magnetic field also give us information on the switching on and of the magnetization process. Okay, with a downward peak close to the coercive field. What happened now for the case when the external field is parallel to the cubic EC axis? In this case, the current is applied along this direction, and also the magnetic field is applied along this direction. In this case, we have a hysteresis loop that is square, representative of EC axis, and this is also reflected in the longitudinal and transversal resistivity. As in our sample, we have that the magnetization is always oriented to the parallel to the 1 - 1 0. Longitudinal resistance does not change, but only shows a downward peak when we switch the magnetization, but remain constant because we are still in the EC axis once we have rotated the external magnetic field. Okay, and the analysis of the transversal resistivity is the same. So what can we do with this experimental result? One, we can model it, okay, by using model based on the Stoner-Wolfram formalism, which consists into propose an energy of the system, and in this case, we consider the Zeeman energy, the cubic anisotropy, and the uniaxial anisotropy. By minimizing this equation, we can obtain the magnetization equilibrium angles for the different directions of the external magnetic field and values of the magnetic field. In this case, or this plot here shows how the angle of the magnetization changes as we change the magnetic field for a phi sub h equals 45 degrees when we apply the magnetic field parallel to the easy axis. Okay, sorry, parallel to the hard axis. Then, once we have obtained the equilibrium magnetization angle from this equation, we can reproduce or we can simulate our longitudinal and transversal resistivity curve because we only need what is the angle between the magnetization and the current. This alpha value, in this case, is equal to the phi sub m value. With that, we can extract or estimate the cubic and uniaxial anisotropy constant. In our case, we fit our Kerr loops and we manage to verify that the cubic anisotropy constant is negative, okay, which is the same we observed in our FMR experiment. And with these two values of K of the cubic and uniaxial anisotropy constant, we can reproduce or simulate the normalized longitudinal resistance. For example, here we have the resistivity as a function of the magnetic field when the field is applied 15 degrees with respect to the easy axis, okay? And we show that the blue points and the red point also reproduces the experimental data. As you can see here, the data shows the downward peak, but these peaks cannot be reproduced if we only consider the global minimum from the minimization of the energy expression. So it is important to consider both the local and the global minimum so we can reproduce the data. Although in most of the cases, we were not able to reproduce the width of the downward peaks, okay? We can estimate or predict where it's going to happen. Okay, but we have to remember that the model has their limitation. At low values of the external magnetic field, the Stoner-Wolfram is not valid at all because the magnetization relaxation and the magnetization process for low for low magnetic field values is dominated by the magnetic field domains that are being formed in the limits of the coercive field. Okay. Finally, I don't know the time. How much time do I have? 3 minutes. Okay. So I am running out of time, but I will let these results related to the spin torque ferromagnetic resonance in iron cobalt. I kindly invite you to visit the poster of my student Chiara just after this presentation, so she can kindly tell you how we determine the damping in these iron cobalt alloys. But what we are current working or current work is to determine what is the effective spin angle extracted from the STFMR experiment. Okay, in our case, we did all the variation, all the experiment on STFMR for different iron cobalt layers, okay, or epitaxial layers, and we can extract the spin hole angle. These results are still we need to take careful of this because this plot was taken last week, so we see a minimum in the effective spin hole angle, but we need to continue to investigate this part. So to conclude, I would like to tell you that we were able to determine that there is a competition between the uniaxial and crystalline anisotropy. We conclude that from the structural and magnetic characterization related to the magnetotransport and spin transport properties. We estimate the value of the cubic and uniaxial anisotropy constant via the magnetoresistance, anisotropic magnetoresistance, and we observe anisotropy in the AMR ratio. And this anisotropy also has a significant dependence with the temperature, depending if we apply the current along the hard or along the easy axis. And our perspective of our ongoing work consists on the determination on the damping-like and fin-like torques in the iron cobalt alloys, also with STFMR. So with that, I would like to finish. I think I have some seconds to acknowledge all the Spintronic team and all the local and international collaboration, and of course, all the funding agencies that share their money with us to continue our research. So with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the very nice talk. We have a few questions in the chat. If anyone has anything else or any more, please feel free to add. From Sonia, she asks, what is the cause of the uniaxial anisotropy constant in iron 65, cobalt 35?
Yes, in this case, some of the sample presented a uniaxial anisotropy, but this is due to the growth process. So probably in the next sample, we can avoid this by rotating the sample to reduce the uniaxial anisotropy. But we have a technical problem in our machine because we have the heater that is on top of the sample, and it's difficult to rotate with all the heater. So as for this sample, we cannot get rid of the uniaxial anisotropy. We have to include it in our calculation, in our simulation, and yes.
So it's not dependent on the composition, it's dependent on
No. It's no, it's not dependent on the composition. Yeah.
Okay. Sonia also asks, how do you define the parallel and perpendicular directions for AMR?
Okay. The perpendicular direction, we define it by the minimum value of the longitudinal resistance in the angular variation. So to calculate the anisotropic magnetoresistance ratio, we take the amplitude, and this value of the resistivity, we use it as a perpendicular resistivity. Yeah, it's a good question because there are some authors that define the perpendicular resistivity as they take an average, I think. But in our case, we use this expression to define the anisotropic magnetoresistance ratio.
I have a bit of a naive question. I'm not familiar with AMR ratios. Is, say, 0.165% a large ratio, or is there any threshold for what's generally accepted if it's like useful for applications? Or
is this value of AMR ratio were similar to the ones reported in different iron cobalt alloys. In different iron cobalt alloys with different concentration, with different epitaxiality or polycrystalline. So these are typical values for this compound. But probably if you compare iron cobalt with other alloys such as permalloy or such as iron nickel, iron cobalt has a relatively low AMR ratio. So, okay.
Okay, thank you. Galen has one question. Galen, go ahead and ask.
Yeah.
There you
Hi, Luis. Thank you for the nice talk. So I'm just have a quick question, maybe based on this slide and the next one, about the temperature dependent measurements you did. So
Yeah.
it looks like you did at 80 Kelvin, 100 and 120. Can you talk a little bit about how you chose these temperatures and if maybe you had plans to try magnetoresistance measurements at even lower temperatures?
Yeah, that would be nice. We choose that temperature because we perform this measurement in a cryostat that supports nitrogen. But if we can go to lower temperature, that could be really interesting. Yeah. It's just because of the limitation of our cryostat at the time we performed the experiment. Yeah.
And in the next slide, I think you show the difference between the 100 and the 120, and it looks like
Yeah.
in the middle figure for 120, it starts to look a little bit more asymmetric between the increasing and decreasing field. Is that just sort of like an artifact here, or why the amplitudes are a little bit larger for increasing field at 120, where they look almost the same at 100
Eh,
Kelvin?
So you mean this amplitude here?
Yeah. So when I'm looking
Okay.
at the red and the blue ones, they
Yeah.
don't look to match as much at 120 Kelvin, but when you look at the 100 Kelvin, it does seem to match a little more closely. I'm just wondering if this starts to look more or less symmetric. Is that dependent on temperature at all?
You mean this here, these two peaks here?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Yeah, but this is because probably if we take more points inside this regime, we can clearly show what's the right amplitude. In the case of 120, the amplitude should be the same as well as in the 100 Kelvin. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Was
And
that
the
your
100, I see
question?
there's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I
Okay.
see now there's more points for the 100. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.
So, thank you. This concludes the talks for session 10.